Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I have a lot to share, and we're going to orient the talk to legislators. And the big topic these days for legislators is labeling. As you know, labeling bills have passed in Maine, Connecticut, and Vermont. And one was introduced last year and narrowly missed a success by 2 votes. And so there's a consideration of whether labeling is a good thing for genetically engineered foods. How many people here are clearly in favor of labeling GMOs? Raise your hand. All right, so I'm seeing 90-ish%, and actually that's typical. There's a 91% or 93% or 89% yes to that question in surveys all over the country. And the question is it worth labeling genetically engineered foods? 64 countries require labeling of GMOs, not the United States and Canada. Is it really worth the bother? So I'm going to talk about why I want GMOs labeled and why many of the physicians that I speak with and lecture to, etc., want GMOs labeled, because there's thousands of physicians now who are prescribing non-GMO diets, and they want them labeled so that their patients and clients can take the doctor's advice. I'm going to not speak much about labeling until the end, because I want to put GMOs in the context, in a much bigger context. What is the regulation? Has it been properly regulated? Is it safe? And I'm going to go into the health dangers of genetically engineered foods and why labeling is pretty critical to allow individuals a choice as to whether they want to expose themselves or their families to GMOs. Now, it's a very big topic in the U.S., and it's getting bigger. I've been involved in this for just under 20 years. And when I started, the response by most people was, what's a GMO? And now, about 75% of Americans are concerned about GMOs, primarily the health dangers. The New York Times poll describes that from 2013. And in 2014, for 40-year-olds and under, GMOs were the #1 food story. What I track are consumer behavior patterns, because I'm looking at a tipping point underway. There was a tipping point that kicked GMOs out of Europe in 1999 when consumers were concerned enough about GMOs so that their use became a marketing liability. And we see in the United States, according to the Hartman survey, actually this was the previous slide, according to the Hartman survey, 40% of Americans say they avoid or reduce GMOs, up from 15% in 2007. Now, let's get a sense of this group right now. Give yourself a number as to how vigilant you have been at avoiding GMOs. And 0 or 1 is what's a GMO, and 100 is extremely vigilant. And I ask this question to audiences all over the country and have for about a decade. So I get a chance to see the changes in the audience over time and also over a lecture, because I'm going to ask you at the end how vigilant you plan to be at avoiding GMOs in about 40 minutes. So give yourself a number, how vigilant, that's both at home and going out to eat, which makes it much harder. So the lowest vigilance is 1 to 20. Most Americans have been in that group for a long time. Raise your hand if you're in that group. 1 to 20. Be bold. Raise your hand. 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100. So it's pretty spread out. Now raise your hand if you've reduced GMOs significantly and noticed an improvement in your health following the change. Raise your hand. Okay, keep your hands up for a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 people in this small room? Now, I started asking that question lecturing during the Prop 37 2012 campaign. And I've asked it at over 100 lectures. And I can tell you that I can predict in advance what the most prevalent symptoms are that people say got better when they avoided or reduced GMOs. And I will let you know how prevalent, if you want to share some of those symptoms now before we start the formal lecture, I will share with you how prevalent that category of symptoms are in my experience, not only speaking to individuals, but also speaking to many, many physicians' conferences in California and around the country, asking them what symptoms and conditions they notice in their patients get better when they prescribe non-GMO diets. So let's hear a symptom or two. Yes?
Most of the time when other people are sick, I don't get sick.
So now your immune system is stronger, you don't get sick as much as you used to? All right. So this is a very common result. More I hear specific things about what people got better from rather than just strengthened. But you'll see in terms of some of the research why a strengthened immune system is related to GMOs. Is there anyone else that's noticed any type of immune system improvement, whether it's autoimmune disease, allergies, asthma, or immune system strength? Raise your hand. Okay, how many allergies? Allergies? Yes, okay. Asthma, anyone? So allergies I found in every single lecture but one. I'm really glad you raised your hand because otherwise I have to say every lecture but two in terms of showing improvement. Okay, another symptom. Yes?
Digestion and digestive issues.
Okay, anyone else with digestion issues? This is always the most popular. Always. Always, in over 100 lectures, always has the number one. It's predictable. And I can tell you some of those digestive disorders, from Crohn's and inflammatory bowel and irritable bowel and acid reflux and bloating and cramping. And there's a book that came out last year from a gastroenterologist, and there's a chapter about why GMOs are very bad for the gastrointestinal tract. In fact, I was giving a lecture, and someone said, you know, I had a very serious GI disorder, and my gastroenterologist said to me, this was 5 or so years ago, I can tell you why you are sick, but I can't write it down because it's too controversial. It's GMOs. So at that point, that doctor was unwilling to go on record that the gastrointestinal disorders that his patient was suffering from and had to do a procedure was related to GMOs because it was too controversial. Another symptom? Yes?
I get rotten headache and my joints would ache for 3 or 4 days when I ate GMO corn, and I get nothing from organic corn.
Okay, so this is interesting. You talk about you have no reaction to organic corn, and yet you react to conventional or genetically engineered. And you also said headaches. Headaches and migraines are a very common description of what gets better. Joint aches, fibromyalgia is also on the list that I hear frequently. But what you said is interesting. Feeling the results with conventional but not organic. I'm going to admit to you that when people came up to me years ago saying that they felt the effects of GMOs, now I had been traveling all over the world. I've been to 41 countries about GMOs, and I've spoken in most states in the United States, and I was representing the scientific opinions, the peer-reviewed published studies, the concerns about scientists. And when people came up to me and said, oh, I feel GMOs, they cause this, this, and this, and I can experience it, I was skeptical. I figured, how would they know? How would they know? I was expecting some kind of small statistical change in the U.S. incidence of those diseases that people would not be able to track individually. And then I went to the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, where I had spoken for a number of years, and they came up with a policy. They did a policy paper, they reviewed the animal feeding studies on GMOs and said, there's clear evidence of harm. And it's not casual, it's causal. They said all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. They said these crops are related to a specific list of diseases and disorders which we're about to get into. So I went to the conference for the 4th year in a row, and I started interviewing the doctors who were prescribing non-GMO diets, and they did not speak like scientists. You know how scientists speak? Any scientists here? All right, so I'm going to make fun of you as a scientist. You know, scientists are, converging lines of evidence suggest that I might be chilly. The definiteness of what scientists say, as a veterinarian and epidemiologist, and the definiteness is somehow antithetical to science in most cases. So I was honoring the scientists and being very cautious. Suggests that, could be, might be. And I was interviewing these doctors and they were saying, GMOs cause inflammation. One allergist said, GMOs cause my allergic patients to have more reactions. One woman said, I give non-GMO diets to every patient and they all get better. And I'm like, really? This is not what I was expecting. So I went to one of the doctor's offices, interviewed the patients, and sure enough, pretty miraculous changes, sometimes within a few days. And she knew how many days it would take for different diseases because she had been prescribing non-GMO diets to 5,000 patients. That told me that her data set was actually larger than any of the scientists that I had been interviewing and describing and translating into English. They're experimenting on us. And that's what gave them intense confidence that GMOs were causing problems, because they were seeing changes in their patients who did the diet versus who didn't do the diet. So now we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, case studies that also fit with the animal feeding studies. In fact, what we're seeing now, anyone else want to share some symptoms? Because I'm going to summarize those symptoms. Anyone else? Yeah.
Leaky gut, chronic fatigue.
Leaky gut, chronic fatigue. Okay. Now, the second most popular improvement in health is increased energy and reduced brain fog. Anyone have increased energy and reduced brain fog from switching? Notice the hands, about the same as digestive disorders in this room. Slightly under that around the country. And then the other symptoms, leaky gut will put into a combination of gastrointestinal disorders, and it's linked to autoimmune disease, it's linked to a lot of other diseases. So I'll talk about leaky gut soon. But the most popular categories that we see, and we're now doing formal surveys to confirm this, gastrointestinal, brain fog and energy, then comes a clumping of immune system changes, headaches and migraines, weight problems, and mental conditions like anxiety, depression. Then you have fibromyalgia and other things. People talk about tumors and diabetes and things like that. And we'll see some of those and why GMOs might be related. Now, if you look at just the human equation, you run into some problems. Primarily because GMOs are not labeled. So it's a strategy to avoid GMOs. You have to reduce processed foods, buy organic. As soon as you reduce processed foods or buy organic, you introduce a host of alternative explanations as to why you're feeling better. I can't tell you if it's because you're getting rid of atrazine in organic foods. Atrazine's not related to GMOs, but it's related to it's not allowed in organic. And if you're switched to non-processed foods, you're getting rid of preservatives and colorings, etc. So as someone trying to identify causation, it's impossible based simply on anecdotal evidence when there is no labeling. So there's a lot of people that believe that the food companies really don't want to label GMOs because then you could actually more easily identify causality. But if we don't have the causal experience with human anecdotal evidence, where else do we look? Animals, exactly. With animal feeding studies, you prepare diets with one change. You raise the animals in exactly the same conditions, and you notice the differences in these different parameters. When the American Academy of Environmental Medicine in 2009 evaluated the animal feeding studies on GMOs, they found, and this list might sound familiar by now, gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, organ damage, also reproductive problems, which is a lower percentage for sure in a group, but the reproductive success only happens a few times in someone's life, so we wouldn't expect it to be the majority of the audience, but it's regular finding in animal feeding studies. Accelerated aging, problems with the synthesis of, or the regulation of cholesterol and insulin. So we see similar categories in the peer-reviewed, published, controlled animal feeding studies afflicting the animals that have been eating GMOs as the description by people of what's getting better when they get rid of GMOs. Another animal data point are farm animals switching from GM feed to non-GM feed, and all they change is GM corn to non-GM corn, or GM soy to non-GM soy. They don't switch to organic, they don't reduce processed foods, you don't have gluten-free pigs or dairy-free cows. And we are hearing from the farmers and the veterinarians the same categories. In the pig farm in Denmark, they eliminated diarrhea in 2 days. They weren't planning to, they just switched to non-GM soy. He didn't tell his farmhand. The farmhand came to him after 2 days and said, "You changed the feed." He said, "Uh-oh, why?" No more diarrhea. It had been causing death. It was uncontrollable for 2 years. They also eliminated death from ulcers and bloat. They eliminated death from lack of appetite. They eliminated birth defects when they switched to non-GMO soy. In a western Iowa farm, they switched to non-GMO corn. The behavior of the pigs changed. Their energy level changed. Their need for medicines dropped by 3/4. In Denmark, it was 2/3. The need for antibiotics dropped. You talked about not getting sick. This is where we see it in animals too. And we're hearing this over and over again as more and more livestock producers switch to non-GMO feed. They spend less on antibiotics and other diseases. And there's really colorful stories about this in the movie Genetic Roulette and many more that we're gathering. So we have lab animals, we have livestock, also pets. We have interviews now with veterinarians who have never seen the kind of result or food allergies among dogs before GMOs were introduced. In the movie Genetic Roulette, Dr. Michael Fox, who has a syndicated column with 25 to 30 million readers, said when GMOs were introduced, he got flooded with questions about the diarrhea, the allergies, the gastrointestinal and the immune system problems. He said, get him off of GMOs. He has a file drawer full of letters saying it worked. And I interviewed one veterinarian. I said, okay, how do you know? You're a holistic veterinarian. You do acupuncture. You do supplements. Have you ever tried everything else? Which says, I always prescribe non-GMO diets, but sometimes they will refuse to change the feed. So everything else doesn't work. The dog has intractable diarrhea. Finally, we switch him to a non-GMO diet. The diarrhea goes away. So we have these overlapping patterns. Now, if these patterns are overlapping, if there is causality, then we should see an increase in the incidence of certain diseases in the United States corresponding with the introduction and expansion of the use of GMOs. And we see that. I'm going to show you some graphs. I want to warn you in advance that the graphs are correlation, not causation. It means this happens and this happens. And you can't tell from the graphs alone whether one causes the other, or whether something else causes both, or whether they're unrelated. But if there is causation, the graphs provide additional support. So we're going to look at that in just a minute, but I first want to introduce some of you to what a GMO is, because some of you may not be familiar. And we'll start by looking at which GMOs are on the market. We have soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa as the 6 main GMOs. And we have, as the minor crops, we have papaya, zucchini, and yellow squash. Now, the papaya, zucchini, and yellow squash are engineered to resist a particular virus that can affect plants. But the other two have two major traits. All six are engineered not to die when sprayed with certain herbicides, primarily Roundup. Monsanto produces Roundup-ready crops. They sell the seeds and they sell Roundup herbicide, and the two form a package. You plant the genetically engineered soybeans, you spray the field with Roundup, the soybeans absorb the Roundup, don't die, just the other biodiversity, the weeds in the field die. We end up eating the Roundup. There's also corn and cotton engineered to produce its own toxic insecticide, Bt toxin, which breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them. Now, the reason why GMOs are on our plates is this one single sentence in the policy of the FDA. The agency is not aware of any information showing that the foods created by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. On the basis of this sentence, the FDA said no safety studies are needed, no labeling is needed. On the basis of this sentence, the FDA said that GMO companies like Monsanto, which is the largest GMO seed producer, can determine on their own if their crops are generally recognized as safe. And if they do, they can put it on the market without even telling the FDA. If they want to tell the FDA, there's a voluntary consultation process, otherwise known as a meaningless exercise, in which Monsanto provides whatever data they want. The FDA may ask some more questions, and they're typically ignored. And at the end of the exercise, the FDA releases a letter confirming, now listen to the words, that Monsanto believes its foods are safe. It does not say that the FDA approves the GMO. It does not say the FDA believes that GMOs are safe. It reminds the company that it's their responsibility to make that determination, and they did. And that's our regulation, our abdication of GMO policy in the United States, created in 1992, still in place. You can introduce a GM crop to the food supply without any government agency needing to know about it.
Wow.
Zero. Some, if they produce their own pesticide, the EPA requires about a week's worth of testing. If it has certain genes from bacteria or viruses, the USDA wants to look at it and do field trials and whatnot. But Scott's Miracle-Gro introduced Kentucky bluegrass. It's genetically engineered, Roundup-ready Kentucky bluegrass. And the USDA said, sorry, this does not fit in our regulatory framework. We have no jurisdiction to determine whether it should be introduced or not, because they didn't use a gene from bacteria or viruses. You see, the administration back in the early 90s did not want Congress to pass any new laws about GMOs. They wanted to fast-track GMOs. They believed GMOs would increase U.S. exports, reduce the trade deficit, and they did not want to create any new rules. So to keep out the pesky Congress people, they asked the EPA, USDA, and FDA to jerry-rig regulations based on existing law that had nothing to do with GMOs. And so they founded in the USDA the Plant Pest Protection. So if it doesn't have a plant pest, the USDA has no jurisdiction. What are the pests? Well, if the genes come from a bacteria or a virus, then it goes into the USDA's jurisdiction. But now, there can be thousands of GMOs where they don't use genes from viruses or bacteria. USDA has nothing to say about it. The EPA only looks at pesticides, so if it doesn't produce a pesticide, EPA has nothing to look about. The FDA already said, we don't even care. If you say it's generally recognized as safe, we believe you. So there is no strong regulation that the biotech industry wants you to believe. And this is backed up, by the way. This is completely, we have documents to show exactly this, that it's complete farce and facade. Now, why is it that GMOs were allowed to be on the market. Why was the sentence there? Turns out the sentence was a lie. Claiming no difference, no significant difference, the sentence was a lie. In reality, 44,000 secret internal memos were made public from a lawsuit, FDA memos, showing that the overwhelming consensus among the scientists employed at the FDA was exactly the opposite, that GMOs were in fact quite different and dangerous. And we have the quotes. You can find them on our website at responsibletechnology.org under the tab Fraud, and you can read how they were angry at the policy words, claiming that we know nothing, therefore we don't have to regulate. They urged them not to use that language, and they pointed out that GMOs, in fact, could create allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and should be subject to long-term studies, including human feeding studies. The science was ignored, the scientists were ignored, the person in charge of policy was Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. Later, Monsanto's vice president in charge of regulatory affairs, now back at the US FDA as the food safety czar. So this is the political science behind GMOs. The real science has not changed. The risks exist. In fact, since 1992, we now have, I would say, overwhelming evidence supporting what the scientists said, that GMOs are risky and should never have been introduced without proper studies. And we have evidence suggesting, notice I'm following the scientists, suggesting, converging lines of evidence suggest that GMOs might be one of the most major contributors to rising disease levels in the United States ever. Suggesting. We'll just look at some of the numbers. Now, we talked about the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. This is their quote, listing some of the things that they found in the animal feeding studies 6 years ago. There's more since then. And here's some of the specific reports from doctors and patients and others who've gotten rid of GMOs and noticed improvement. And this is a partial list. You've heard some of them today. And then we have the livestock list, which is growing. Very similar categories. And now we see the pattern between humans, livestock, animal feeding studies, pets. And now let's take a look at the correlational evidence. Now, I can't see that far. This is adjusted deaths due to stroke. Now let me explain what we're seeing here. The line, the green line, is the trend before GMOs were introduced. You have the red line, which is the incidence of the amount of Roundup sprayed on soy and corn, because most of the crops are Roundup ready, and soy and corn are the major ones in the United States. And then the blue line is the incidence of GMO soy and corn. So you can see that at the point where GMOs were introduced and Roundup started to increase, the incidence of deaths by stroke increased. This does not prove causation, but it causes us to scratch our heads and should require, among other findings which you're about to see, a federal investigation, epidemiological evaluation, case studies taken, etc., etc. These are falling on deaf ears. The US government is promoting GMOs. The FDA's position officially is to promote GMOs. Same with USDA and EPA. The State Department, according to the WikiLeaks, is basically Monsanto's enforcement wing around the world, pushing it on other countries through bilateral trade agreements and other things, and we can share that information with Q&A if you'd like. Deaths from senile dementia. Deaths from Alzheimer's. Deaths from Parkinson's disease. Deaths due to obesity. Deaths due to kidney failure. Hepatitis C hospital discharges. Deaths due to high blood pressure. Deaths due to intestinal infection. Inflammatory bowel disease. Autism. Diabetes. Notice the trend line, flat before the introduction. Congenital birth defects. Bile duct and liver cancer. Kidney and renal pelvic cancer. Bladder and urinary tract cancer. Thyroid cancer. Deaths due to leukemia. And by the way, we rank last of the 17 industrialized countries on deaths from all these different, a variety of reasons. So, we'll come back to this. Now, is it possible? Is it theoretically possible that GMOs are related to so many different diseases? Let's take a look at the nature of GMOs to see if and how this one introduction into our food supply might be causing an increase. Obviously, it's not solely responsible for these diseases. They've been around longer than GMOs have. But is it possible that they're contributing to the symptoms that you heard today, to the changes in the cows and pigs we talked about, and to these increases? So I'm going to give you 3 different ways that GMOs might be responsible. The first is the process of genetic engineering itself. Here's how that works. Let's say you want to create a corn plant that produces a toxic insecticide in every cell. So you take bacteria from the soil called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. You take the gene that produces a toxin out of that soil bacterium. You make millions of copies and put it into a gun, and then shoot that gun into a plate of millions of cells. Then you clone the cells that got the gene into a crop, and now every single cell of that corn plant has a gene-sized spray bottle producing BT toxin that breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them. And these are planted on millions and millions of acres in the United States and some other countries. Now the process of insertion, whether done by gene gun or by bacterial infection, plus the cloning, creates massive collateral damage. There can be 2 to 4% of the DNA different at the end of the day. 2 to 4%. Completely different through mutations. Genes can be deleted, expanded. In fact, one study showed up to 5% of existing natural genes in a DNA changed their activity when a single gene was inserted. This is the background collateral damage. It is expected. It is the most common result of genetic engineering, surprise side effects. And yet it is not evaluated and not required to be evaluated by the regulatory authorities and typically ignored by the producers of GMO seeds. Dr. Arpad Pustai, the world's leading expert at a certain type of protein called lectin, was given a $3 million grant by the UK government to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs in the mid-90s. And he took a genetically engineered potato, engineered to produce an insecticide, and fed it to a group of rats, fed a second group of rats natural potatoes, and a third group were fed natural potatoes, but their diet was spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potato produced at the same level. Only the GM potato eating group got sick. They had potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, and damaged immune system. This is a picture of the intestinal walls on the right of the rats fed the potato that was genetically engineered compared to controls after just 10 days. This is a picture of the stomach lining, gastrointestinal disorders after just 10 days. What was the cause of the problem? It was not the insecticide, because one of the controls was eating the insecticide in every meal at the same amount that the GMO eaters were eating. So his conclusion was the process of genetic engineering caused significant disruption, leading to these effects. This was a complete surprise to him. He was a pro-GMO scientist expecting GMOs to fly onto the market. He went public with his concerns, was a hero for 2 days at his prestigious institute, the top nutritional research lab in the world, or one of them, in Aberdeen, Scotland. And 2 phone calls were allegedly placed from the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director of the institute. The next day, Dr. Pustai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. They disbanded his team, withheld the data, and embarked on a campaign to destroy his reputation. This type of treatment has been repeated over and over again for more than a decade, even written about in Nature, in the journal Nature. Anytime someone shows adverse findings about GMOs, they are attacked. Why? Because food is not supposed to have toxins. It's not supposed to cause these type of problems. The entire basis of GMO production and promotion is based on the lie that there's no difference. And if it shows in research that there is a difference, it destroys the basis of this multi-billion-dollar industry. So there are groups, there are front groups, there are scientists on the payroll of the biotech industry. One of their jobs is to attack anyone and any research that shows a problem, to protect the fortunes of the biotech industry. And the biotech industry will also create tobacco research, and we've caught them red-handed. In my book, Genetic Roulette, for anyone who's interested, there's a section which shows how they violate scientific principles to force a conclusion of safety, even at times when the rats are dying at double the rate compared to the controls. That they've designed their research to avoid finding problems and then use unscientific excuses when problems are nonetheless discovered. After 7 months and 1 heart attack, the scientist was finally able to speak. His gag order was lifted by an order of Parliament, and this has been published. But what it shows is that the generic process of genetic engineering caused all those changes in the rats within just 10 days. Now, that potato was never introduced, but the corn was introduced, the genetically engineered corn, most popular brand by Monsanto. After it was on the market, independent researchers looked at all the changes in the proteins and found 43 different proteins, either way up or way down or shut down or turned on, including a gene that has never before been on in that corn that produces an allergen called gamazine. Now, if there is an allergen in the food that you are reacting to, do you want it labeled? Yes. There are people who live their life around, the entire family organizes everything around a kid with a peanut allergy or some other allergy. What if you're not saying, oh, sorry, we're not going to allow peanuts to be labeled on the package? You're putting their life at risk. We now know that Monsanto's BT corn, the most popular variety, has a new allergen that's ignored and not on the label. And their soy has a up to 7-fold increase of a soy allergen called trypsin inhibitor. Ignored. It also has higher levels of lignin, and the metabolic pathway that produces lignin produces rotenone, and according to one scientist who works at the Salk Institute, the metabolic pathway that produces that rotenone is related to Parkinson's disease. Roundup is also related to Parkinson's disease. So eating genetically engineered soy, eating Roundup, might have increased Parkinson's disease. But no one is evaluating these type of data. In fact, if you do risk doing an evaluation of GMOs, a health basis, you risk your career. I have talked to scientists who say they know hundreds of others that refuse to do research in this area because of the threat to themselves, their career, their families, etc. And we have documented so many scientists who stepped up and got pummeled. The second cause of concern is the Bt toxin, the one that's poking holes in human cells. Now, the EPA's Scientific Advisory Panel looked at laboratory studies with mice and studies with farm laborers and farmers, and showed that there was immune reaction to this toxin, which is used in spray form. So you can gather all the bacteria, all the toxins and whatnot, and spray it on plants and kill certain insects, and the GMOs allow the plant to do the spraying itself, so to speak. So they approved the GM crops because the spray was already on the market. Never mind that the crops produce it in up to 5,000 times the concentration. They produce a more toxic variety. The spray washes off. The one in the plant doesn't wash off. It's encapsulated. They claim that the spray was safe, but their own scientific advisory panel, the top allergists in the country, said no, actually there's evidence showing that the Bt toxin itself is an allergen and should be evaluated, totally ignored by the EPA to promote GMOs. Now, in 2012, a study showed that Bt toxin, in spite of the assurances by companies like Monsanto, does in fact poke holes in human cells. So if we're eating genetically engineered corn and it is poking holes in human cells, that might create some of the gastrointestinal problems we just heard about. If it's creating leaky gut is where holes in the walls of the one-cell thick intestinal wall, one cell thick, if there's holes there, then things can get into the bloodstream that are not supposed to be there. Undigested food proteins are related to autoimmune disease. Here's how it works. Usually the digestive system is supposed to break things down to itsy-bitsy pieces. That's a scientific term. If it has holes, then undigested food proteins can get into the bloodstream. The immune system attacks it. They all take out their iPhones and they take pictures. You're going to all be on mine. Here we go, Facebook. So we'll pretend you're undigested food protein. So they all take pictures and put it on the Facebook and say, attack anything that looks like this. But they have an old version of the iPhone. It doesn't have a very, good camera. And so it's a little fuzzy. And so the immune system starts attacking anything that looks like that, which includes the thyroid, the pancreas, the microvilli and the gut walls. That's called autoimmune disease. And it is correlated with leaky gut because the body starts attacking itself because it mistakes it for something that's foreign and an invader. Leaky gut is also linked to food allergies, inflammation, cancer, autism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And if you're poking holes in human cells with Bt toxin, it might be related to consumption of GM corn as well. Now, in Canada, they found 93% of the pregnant women tested had Bt toxin in their blood, and 80% of the unborn fetuses. Now, if you have Bt toxin in the blood, well, how did it get there? Maybe through the holes that it created. According to a study on albino mice, Bt toxin is toxic to red blood cells and might cause leukemia. So we have, because Canada's not that different from the United States, we have probably a lot of people, Bt toxin, in our bloodstream. 80% of the unborn fetuses. Fetuses don't have blood-brain barriers. If it gets into the brain, we have a hole-poking toxin in the brain of the fetuses of this generation in North America, which might be related to cognitive disorders. No one is looking. I can't guarantee that this is causing a problem, but no one can guarantee that it isn't. But certain moms, pregnant women, may want to avoid eating Bt toxin. Labeling is important. Now, I wish I could turn this off for a second. I'll come back to the side. Bt toxin in the blood should wash out very quickly. If it washes out very quickly, why would 93% of the pregnant women tested have Bt toxin in their blood? They must be eating Bt toxin every day, or often. But it's not Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. It's Canada. High fructose corn syrup does not have Bt toxin in it. What's the source? They don't eat a lot of corn there. The author of the study suggested it was actually eating the milk and meat of animals fed the Bt corn every day, and that it survived the digestion in the pigs and cows, maybe in the milk, and then we were eating it from them. That's plausible, but there's another potential. In 2004, a study was published in Nature Biotechnology, where they found that part of the gene inserted into soybeans to make those soybeans Roundup ready transferred into the DNA of gut bacteria. And that gut bacteria was unkillable with Roundup. Suggesting, but not proving, suggesting that the transferred gene was still functioning. Now, what happens if you transfer the Bt toxin gene from corn chips. How many people eat corn chips? Polenta, corn tortillas, anything corn? What if you eat corn made from Bt corn, which is the majority of corn in the United States, and the gene that produces the toxin transfers to your gut bacteria? You might turn it into living pesticide factories. No one studied this. This was a UK government-funded study that did the soybeans. As soon as they discovered that genes actually transfer, they pulled the funding research for any follow-up. So we don't know. No one has studied this question. But if the gene transferred and if we are producing Bt toxin in our gut, that might be a better explanation as to why 93% of the pregnant women in Canada had Bt toxin in their blood, because they are producing it in their intestines. So I'm pointing out this is a potential risk. This is a very serious risk, not evaluated. I don't want to be exposed to that. The third problem that we're going to look at today, and there's more, is increased herbicide use. When you use a lot of herbicides, it's like overusing antibiotics. The bacteria develops resistance. When you use a lot of weed killers, the weeds develop resistance. So in the United States, they used a ton of Roundup. The increased use of herbicides because of these herbicide-tolerant crops was over 500 million pounds in the first 16 years. Even though Monsanto said it's going to reduce the use of herbicides, they were quietly increasing their factories to produce Roundup. So we have a tremendous amount of Roundup. It's found in 60 to 100% of rain samples and air samples in the Midwest. It is so prevalent. And it is dangerous. I don't want to get into this particular slide or the dozens of slides like this that show the parts per million on the left and the system of the body that is damaged by the active ingredient of Roundup, glyphosate. But it's tiny amounts. There's a study that shows, I just read this 2 days ago, that shows multiplication of human breast cancer cells with glyphosate at a concentration of parts per quadrillion. That's below parts per trillion, below parts per billion. It has a tremendous impact on so many systems. In fact, one study reviewed the biochemistry of the active ingredient in Roundup and linked it to, and you may recognize some of these diseases from the graphs, it linked it to gastrointestinal disorders, reproductive disorders, cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, aggression, depression, anorexia nervosa, multiple sclerosis. Another study linked it to gluten sensitivity, which is exploding, and kidney failure. Another one just linked it, I spoke to the author today, to neurological disorders because of messing up the pineal gland when people have exposure to aluminum and glyphosate, because they can act together. And there's more coming out. I'm on so many lists of doctors and scientists who are alarmed. Many of these people describe Roundup as the most chronically toxic chemical on the planet. One organization gave Roundup the toxic chemical of the year in 2014. You know, it's a proud award. Monsanto got awarded the most evil company, got voted consistently, or most hated company year after year. Now, I'm going to describe a little bit more about Roundup so you understand what's going on. Roundup is patented as an antibiotic, but it kills beneficial gut bacteria, not the E. coli, salmonella, botulism, and negative stuff. So if you create negative gut bacterial overgrowth, that's linked to leaky gut, it's linked to all sorts of things. The gut bacteria is 70% of our immune system, is inside the digestive tract, most of it in the gut bacteria. The gut bacteria are involved in digestion, in vitamin production, and the Roundup also blocks a pathway used by the gut bacteria to produce tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin and melatonin. So if we're low on serotonin and melatonin, we may have sleeplessness, we may have depression, we may have anxiety, we may not know when we're full and just continue to eat, we may have blood sugar regulation problems. And that's all on the rise in the United States. The Roundup also blocks a detoxification pathway in the liver. So that means if you take any other toxin, in the food or in the environment, it could be amplified because the liver may be disabled from its efficiency in releasing it from the body. It also may be involved in reducing vitamin D synthesis for the same pathway. We have an epidemic of vitamin D deficiency, which is linked to so many things, including preterm babies, which are also on the rise. It becomes a mess. So no one in the government is doing this research. There's no real money available for it. So we have some research and a lot of speculation and an exposure that is unprecedented. And the USDA stopped monitoring residues and usage of Roundup years ago. They monitor everything else, but not Roundup. Here's a picture of the liver of mice, or rats, fed GM Roundup-ready soybeans on the right compared to those on the left. This is a picture of testicles that changed from pink to blue in rats that were fed genetically modified Roundup-ready soybeans. I'd like to use this slide as an opportunity to take a long, slow drink of water. Let this picture have an influence on at least half the audience. Mice fed GM soy also had changes in their testicles, including damaged young sperm cells, and female rats had damage to the uterus and ovaries. Now, I gave a talk at the European Parliament some years ago with a senior researcher scientist at the National Academy of Sciences, Irina Ermakova. She gave me the following few slides. So these are Russian-speaking rats, and they volunteered to be part of a GM soy feeding study. They are female rats, and they were fed GM soy starting 2 weeks before they got pregnant. And through pregnancy and lactation, and more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to 10% of the control who was eating non-GM soy, or 6% when we're eating no soy whatsoever. The animals feeding who were born of the GM-fed moms also had trouble giving birth. They were basically sterile. They were also smaller on average, as you can see, the control versus the GM rat. Now, another Russian Academy of Sciences-based study found that with hamsters, this is not published, the other one's published, this is not yet published. I've corresponded with the scientists. They're trying to figure out the exact causation. They fed hamsters GM soybeans and found by the third generation there was also a tremendous death rate of animals, 4 to 5 times the controls in terms of infant mortality. There was also hair growing in the mouths of many of the offspring, and the third generation were basically sterile. Very few had the ability to have babies. Now, there was a study that extended Monsanto's study. Monsanto's studies that they submit to other countries are typically 90 days. And animal feeding studies at 90 days miss almost everything. And the way they design it, they're designed to miss everything. But they claim that within 90 days, their rats passed with flying colors. But a French scientist who's an expert in toxicological research was on the committee in France that reviewed the secret research submitted by the biotech industry for approvals, and noted that rats that had been fed Monsanto's corn had as much as 50 different statistically significant changes and signs of toxicity. So they published their research when they finally were able to wrestle that data into the public domain through lawsuits, etc. They published the data showing 3 different types of corn from Monsanto, all signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys. And then they secretly extended Monsanto's study by doing their own. Same type of rats, same foods, 2 years. And the rats developed, they died earlier if they were eating the GMOs. They had multiple massive tumors, and they had damaged liver, kidneys, and pituitary glands. Here's a picture of some of the rats with massive tumors. Now, they weren't planning a cancer study, because you usually need larger numbers of rats for a cancer study. They were doing a toxicological study. And when did the tumors start forming? In the 4th month, the month after Monsanto stops testing effects of their GM crops on rats. Now, there are 3 types of rats here. they did something very interesting that Monsanto didn't do. They not only extended it for 2 years, they tested so many more things that Monsanto had ignored and found all these different changes. And they tested different feeding groups. They tested the Roundup ready corn, sprayed with Roundup, that's how we eat it, and found multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. Then they fed rats in another feeding study at the same time Roundup ready corn that had never been sprayed with Roundup to see which is it. Is it the Roundup or is it the corn? Multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. Then they fed another group of rats just the Roundup. No genetically engineered corn. It was normal corn. Multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. So the two alone, the Roundup, at levels that were a fraction of that allowed in the drinking water in the United States, were put in the drinking water of the rats and led to these problems. In Iowa, a farmer and scientist teamed up and fed GM soy and corn to pigs. And they brought the pigs to the slaughterhouse along with the controls and said, hold back the organs. This is a picture of the stomach on the right, a typical stomach from the GM-fed group. Severe inflammation and irritation. The uteruses were also 25% heavier than the controls. The one on the left, the group eating the non-GMO corn. Again, gastrointestinal problems, which we talked about earlier. I talked to a farmer who does his own on-farm slaughtering, and on the basis of that, his wife said she would never feed her children meat or products from animals fed GMOs, because she's seen the inside, discolored and a very strong stench, which might be the change in the gut bacteria. And the carcasses here are about a year old, but the one on the right that was GMO fed looks more like a 15-year-old, the discoloration. So they may actually get less money at the marketplace as a result. Now, I gave a talk to the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Genetic Engineering last year, and I made some recommendations. And I could have spent hours. They gave me 20 minutes, and I just spoke fast. I'm from New York originally, so I can call a hockey game in my sleep. I can talk fast. I moved to Iowa. They don't understand me there. So I mentioned some of the holes in the regulatory framework that need to be filled, like independent studies that are required, long-term studies, intergenerational studies. Now, that's just the FDA's area. If you look at the EPA is consciously avoiding 21st century science. Everyone has heard the word endocrine disruption. Everyone has heard endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors mess up our hormones. And one thing that they discovered is that they mess up the hormones at tiny concentrations, parts per trillion, parts per billion. The EPA ignores entirely any evaluation of endocrine disruption in reviewing the toxicity of Roundup and other herbicides and pesticides. They assume that it is basically a linear dose. You have more toxins, you'll have a higher dose. But in reality, when you have endocrine disruption, it may only show up at tiny doses, very, very high response rate. And then as you add more Roundup, the response gets lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, and then bottoms out. And then it takes over the normal toxicity, it starts going up. So it's called a U-shaped response curve. High at very low levels, high at very high levels, nothing in between. The EPA cuts off that left side, pushes it over to the out of sight, out of mind, and ignores the endocrine disruption, which has been linked to multiplying breast cancer cells at very, very low doses, at parts per quadrillion and parts per trillion in Roundup, or glyphosate, its active ingredient. So one of my recommendations was wake up to the endocrine disruption. But also it's not just that. They look just at the so-called active ingredient of Roundup and ask the companies to do the tests on that, on the glyphosate. Whereas independent studies show that the whole Roundup formulation is as much as 1 1,000 times more toxic than the glyphosate alone. The EPA ignores that. When we eat pesticides and herbicides, they are mixed in our bodies, so we get some from column A and some from column B. Sometimes they're actually mixed together in the same tank. They just approved a combination of 2,4-D and Roundup because they just now are introducing 2,4-D resistant crops, which is a product. 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange linked to cancer and birth defects, so that's expected to go up by 25-fold. 2 weeks ago, they approved dicamba-resistant crops, and they expect it to go up as much as 500-fold in its applications of soybeans. So now we have dicamba increased in our diet. They don't check the combinations of those for toxicities, and there's a lot of research showing that the combination is far more powerful than alone. So they are basically not even in the 20th century, because we knew about this in the last decade of the 20th century. They're ignoring the science for why? For political reasons, for economic reasons, certainly not on the basis of science. Now, what's actually happening is the consumers are becoming aware of GMOs. We said earlier that 40% of Americans say they're avoiding or reducing GMOs. I don't believe that 40% are actually saying what they're doing, but it's up from 15% in 2007, so the popularity of avoiding or reducing GMOs is certainly up. And 53% of Americans say that if GMOs were labeled, they would refuse to eat them because they're concerned about some of the things we talked about. What is happening now in the United States is the non-GMO labeled products, voluntarily labeled, are actually gaining an upper hand in the marketplace. And there was a tipping point in the natural products industry in 2013 when everyone basically rushed to become non-GMO project verified, third-party verified. Now over $8.5 billion of sales are in products that are labeled non-GMO by the non-GMO project. And now, on behalf of them, in addition, you have Cheerios original formula and Grape Nuts and Ben & Jerry's and Chipotle's and Target home brands and Can't Believe It's Not Butter and Smart Balance Buttery Spread, all saying non-GMO because it's popular, because that's what people are demanding. If you're seeing a change in the marketplace, you know, as a politician, you're too late. The change in the marketplace happens after the trend in consumer spending, and the trend in consumer spending happens after consumer education and concern. So if you're still working with Monsanto, voted as the most hated company on the planet, maybe you should think different, especially when you're thinking about appealing to the younger people who, for the 40 and below, the GMO issue was the #1 food story in 2014. It is gaining traction. And I happen to be an early indicator because I'm the only one that's been crisscrossing the United States for 12 years speaking about GMOs, and I get to hear from audiences, and what's happening this year and last year and the year before is unprecedented and growing leaps and bounds. It is unbelievable what's happening. So the demand is only growing, the pressure is only growing, and the popularity of those politicians who take the consumer angle and say, yes, we need to label these so people have a choice, that popularity is growing also by leaps and bounds. Now, fortunately with the labeling issue, now we're getting back to labeling here. With the labeling issue, you don't have to believe anything I just said. You don't have to believe that GMOs have any problem whatsoever. You can love GMOs, but you need them labeled so you can find them so you can eat them. But it's good to know that more and more people in the United States do believe these numbers. I speak at medical conferences around the year in different parts of the world, and I can say, I ask the audiences there, rate yourself from 1 to 100, how vigilant you've been in avoiding GMOs before and after. I'm about to ask you the after, because I asked those of you who were here at the beginning that question. And I also ask, raise your hand or rate yourself from 1 to 100, how active you've been at prescribing non-GMO diets. So I get to see the footprint of the 2,500 chiropractors in Southern California last year, and the other one in San Francisco Bay Area, and the other ones, the naturopaths and the people involved with Andrew Weil's integrative medicine and Loma Linda. You know, I ask all these different groups, how many are prescribing non-GMO diets? Then I give my talk and say, okay, rate yourself from 1 to 100. how vigilant you plan to be at prescribing non-GMO diets. And they come up to me afterwards, after this huge vote in favor of that. This might explain what I'm seeing in my practice. Since GMOs introduced, I'm seeing this up and this up and this up. And then they come to me later on, if I go back to the same conference years later, and they say, I'm prescribing non-GMO diets, and people are getting better. So I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100, how vigilant you plan to be at avoiding GMOs next week. So 1 to 20 is low vigilance, basically whatever. How many people plan to be low vigilant? 1 to 20, raise your hand. 20 to 40, no peer pressure. 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. You notice what just happened? It happens every time. It happens every time. All it involves is telling the truth. And so now you know why there is a snowball effect. I did not ask the question I typically ask all over the country at the beginning, is to rate yourself from 1 to 100, how active you've been talking about GMOs to others. The same thing happens, from low to very high at this point. So the same information that changes people's diet automatically goes viral. That's what's happening. We are in a situation where so many people now are avoiding GMOs. We had 19 people in this very small room said that they felt better, they had improved health when they got rid of GMOs. Think about the word of mouth. People like to talk about health. They like to talk about what's hurting. And if they find something that gets them better, they love talking about that, especially to others that are hurting from the same thing. So the word of mouth is going crazy right now. So by this time next year, there's going to be a whole new crop of people, crop shouldn't be the good word here, a whole new group of people looking for non-GMO food. And then they're going to find out, what? Our legislature voted it down? So what's happening now is the demand is accelerating. The science is peaking. As I said earlier, I get new science now every week. Most of the new research is on the dangers of Roundup because there's very little money available to test for GMOs. A recent study showed inflammation and allergic reaction into respiratory tract of animals to BT toxin. Another one showed the Roundup Ready soy and corn had toxic effects. I don't need to go into those details. There's dozens of them. I wrote a book called Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods back in 2007. There's 1,153 endnotes, and there's a lot more available now. And I can get you, whoever needs that information, I can tell you where to find it. There's plenty of science. And then there's the industry science, which is tobacco science. The industry has a tremendous power. There were 20 lobbyists in the Capitol building last year, 20, striking down the vote for labeling. They spent collectively $100 million in the states trying to get ballot initiatives passed. This was in this state house. There was $100 million spent between California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, giving disinformation. As some of you are aware, there's no law that requires you to tell the truth in a political advertisement. It's not illegal to lie on TV in an advertisement that's political. It is not illegal. And that is, they have used that loophole to say that labeling is going to increase costs, even though Consumer Reports basically said ridiculous. It's going to hurt farmers, small business, put the state at a disadvantage. I mean, at a disadvantage. If you look at the history of GMO introduction, every country that introduced it had a huge disadvantage because there's so many closed markets. And now that we're seeing so much demand for non-GMO, the places that actually pre-segregate and have non-GMO verified stuff are selling it at a premium. And I've visited a lot of these ministers of agriculture, sometimes before they went ahead and introduced it, and they wish they had listened to us because we said, you will lose markets, and they did. The U.S. spent $3 to $5 billion per year extra in subsidies to prop up the prices of the GMO crops that no one wanted after they were introduced. So the lies are well documented, but they're also well funded. So that's why with our $1.95, we get it out to people they get it out to people, it gets placed, we create films, and it's working. So I'm going to end here and say this. My goal here, really, personally, is to end the use of GMOs in food and to stop the outdoor release of GMOs in the current generation. I'm not against genetic engineering per se. I'm not against genetic engineering research. I'm not against using genetic engineering in a laboratory setting to create medicines with care. But there's no justification for releasing it into the environment where it can contaminate, cross-pollinate, and becomes irreversible. We have no technology today, no technology to clean up a contaminated gene pool. The genes already released will outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. The only thing that lasts longer than self-propagating genetic pollution is extinction. So we should use every single excuse not to introduce new GMOs until we're absolutely sure that they're safe. The exact opposite happened. The warnings by the scientists of the FDA were ignored. They were put on the market for political reasons. So whether it's for future generations or our gut bacteria or your children, I would like to suggest that you take steps now at this very potent time to help educate others about the dangers of GMOs so they can make healthier choices. And for the legislators and the legislature, please help us. You don't have to believe anything. Just give us the sovereignty to make the choices ourselves. It should never have been handed to you to be dealing with labeling. It's in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that a new additive has to be labeled as such. It was ignored, and many people believe illegally. The reason why it's on your plate is because of abdication at the federal level, which is because of political collusion and industry manipulation based on the usual politics. That is why the people of the state, the leaders of the state, have to take the sovereignty up, have to take the decisions up. The epidemic that I've seen around the world that has been the basis for a GMO expansion is the theory that it's someone else's responsibility, and I'm sure they're doing a good job. I go to other countries and they say, we don't have to regulate it because the FDA regulates it. Well, the FDA doesn't regulate it, they allow Monsanto to make the choice. I would like to suggest and charge with the legislators with taking up the responsibility because no one else is. It should not have been on your plate, but it's here. In fact, since you guys allow it to be planted, Mendocino banned it in their county, and then it was banned in Santa Cruz and Trinity and other counties, and Marin, because it hasn't been handled well at the levels above. So it may be a pain in the neck to have to bring up this issue, but it's so important. Everyone's health, all future generations. Please join us. Label GMOs, and eventually, hopefully, we will eliminate GMOs in the current generation and see those graphs, or some of them, reverse. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take some questions. Yes.
Okay, I'm Charlene. I would like to ask, how do you trust companies, though, that can just be putting the labels on it? How do we research to find out if they're really being upfront about, or they're just following along the trend and putting the labels on there to appease us?
All right, if we have mandatory labels, how can we trust the mandatory label?
Right.
Well, if someone actually has a mandatory label law in a state, they're only going to label it if GMOs are there. And they generally don't want to. So if they put it on there, we trust them.
Okay.
If they avoid it, even though there are GMOs there, if it's a GMO that's detectable in the final product, in other words, if you can just take that box off the shelf and send it to a laboratory, they're exposed completely. It's like Kashi cereal, supposedly a health food cereal. Everyone in the health food industry thought, oh, we can eat Kashi. It had 100%, the soy was 100% GMO. When that was made available, they're sales plunged. It was
What about
just
the reverse though? If it
the reverse.
says- Yeah, if it says
Non-GMO. For
you
non-GMO,
trust that.
we recommend the non-GMO project verification because they require testing with certified laboratories. They require documentation. Now, anyone can theoretically cheat, but when you deal with brand reputations, Kashi's a good example. They will not recover in the near term for the loss of loyalty from their customers who realized that for years they were eating GM soy and corn, not knowing it. And if they're discovered as lying, the loss would be far greater than taking the steps to remove GMOs. I've talked to some executives at large natural food consolidators or big companies that have lots and lots of brands, and they say when they buy a brand, they're typically much stronger in their non-GMO regimentation than the brand was originally because they have a lot more to lose. So I'm not concerned about that generally. If you see something that's not third-party verified, you don't even know what their criteria is. When Cheerios became non-GMO, I called them and said, what does that mean? Are you using PCR tests? I used to work at a GMO detection laboratory. I know what that is. Are you using ELISA strip tests? What's your rejection threshold? Are you just using, affidavits? They said, we don't disclose that information. So it's a label, but it's also hard to interpret. Next question? Yes.
I've been asked to do a presentation about the evolution of food for a couple science clubs. What evidence sources would you suggest me using, and what should be my main key points to speak on?
Well, evolution of food is too big for me. It's way above my pay grade. So to speak about GMOs, I would say the best documentation right now is an online book called GMO Myths and Truths. And it lists all the myths by the biotech industry: feed the world, safe, good for economy, and documents it very, very carefully with peer-reviewed published studies and reports showing that it was all PR. That's online at earthopensource.org. Now, for the health side, they do cover it. My book is old compared to theirs. It's 2007. It has more details in it than theirs, but it's not up to date. So you can look at that for some information, but it won't be the current situation. So I would say for GMOs, that's a good source. Yes?
They have organic GMO food and...
Organic non-GMO.
No, there's organic foods as GMO. The barcode
No.
is a determining factor.
No, there's no, organic is not allowed to intentionally use GMOs.
Okay, ever.
No.
Okay.
There may be contamination and no testing is required, but organic is not allowed. It's a prohibited substance in organic.
So there is no organic GMO.
There's no organic GMO today.
So if
If it says organic or 100% organic or made with organic ingredients on the front, there's not allowed to be GMOs in the package.
I mean the produce.
The produce that's genetically engineered is zucchini, yellow squash, papaya, and corn on the cob. Only 4. Ignore the PLU code. Ignore that. It's just don't pay any attention to that. If it says organic, it's not supposed to be GMO. There might be contamination in the back.
What about if some products they have the label non-GMO verified project and they are not non-GMO? Because
You mean are not organic?
They are not organic, even if they have the labels on. They are existing products which they have labels on, but they are not organics and they are not non-GMO.
All right. If it has the non-GMO label, then the non-GMO label for non-GMO project has a tolerance or an action threshold of 0.9%. Now that means that if you find something that's non-GMO verified, if you find something that's organic and it contains corn or soy or canola, it's not going to be a 100% guarantee. Now, Roundup, it turns out, is not only sprayed on Roundup Ready crops, it's sprayed on many crops to dry it down before harvest as a ripening agent. So it is sprayed on wheat, barley, rye, lentils, sugar cane. It's sprayed on potatoes, sweet potatoes, some other things. And so it becomes more important to buy organic than ever before, because if you just buy non-GMO Project Verified and it's a loaf of bread, it might be wheat that's been sprayed with Roundup. So it's now imperative for those that especially highly sensitive or already suffering from certain conditions, switch to 100% organic and see what changes in your body. I just visited a family that had 21 chronic symptoms between the 5 of them. And the mom had a lot of them, and most of them. And she became a student of nutrition and started to experiment with the family. They took out gluten, they took out casein. When they took out GMOs, the symptoms disappeared, including the autism diagnosis for the son. We're documenting. Yes?
So, how do we, like when I go shopping, I look for organic. Knowing what you said about USDA, when it has the USDA label, or it just has the grocery store label, you know, there's 2 different kinds.
So anything that says organic in the United States is always according to the USDA standards.
Okay.
And it can either be 100% organic or 95% organic or 70% organic, depending on how, but if it says organic on the front, the whole thing is supposed to be non-GMO.
But does that mean, what's the percentage that is allowed for it to have the name organic on
Okay,
it?
so 100% organic, it has to be 100%. Okay. Organic means 95. Made with organic blank, ingredients, soybeans, 70. Yes?
If the Chinese have our loads of corn, we sent them organic corn, but they tested it and found out that indeed some of that corn had been contaminated by GMOs, and they rejected the whole shipment. If this is happening, why aren't we seeing more devastation to our farms and to the farmers and to the economy?
So it's a little more nuanced. They weren't shipped organic corn, they were shipped corn. And it contained a Syngenta brand of corn that had not yet been approved. So for most of 2014 and part of 2013, a lot of corn exports got turned away, and there was a big drop in corn prices, and Syngenta's being sued for more than $1 billion right now by corn producers and by Cargill and ADM. But this is typical. I've been doing this, for years, for 2 decades, and I've seen this kind of thing: rejections by Europe of unapproved varieties of corn, of rejections of flax. I mean, it's typical that when there's not massive approvals of the same product across the board, you can expect that there's going to be recalls or rejections. And the biotech industry has been stupid about it, and so has the U.S. government. For example, in 2000, the EPA had said, you can plant Starlink corn, but only for animal consumption and not human consumption. How stupid is that? I mean, they were never farmers. They don't know that there's cross-pollination and mixing and whatnot. Well, it was found. I worked at a laboratory that discovered it. And it cost $1 billion. 315 products were subject to recall. U.S. exports closed. Products dropped. It was terrible. But it was based on the fact that you can't control it. Yeah.
I know about a month or 2 ago, there was this brief kind of, that halo effect when it's in the media. McDonald's has refused to buy GMO potatoes. Now, I thought that would have massive repercussions because, they're ginormous. They're all over the world. I have this problem. I'm 60, and I've been doing, advocating on food literacy and food issues and food justice since 1968. And when I went up last month when we had a big rally to my senator, I just got a lot of obfuscation and just baloney. And I was real polite because...
In politics? Sorry. My apologies. I just couldn't resist.
And so, as somebody who's done this work since I'm older than dirt, I'm 60, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm really kind of at the point where I'm not going to waste my time talking to politicians because I just don't think they get it. There's
All right,
a
so
few
I
we
want to
did.
respond to that. 'cause
And so I think what we have to do, you know, there's a lot of people who've been sustainable, raised organic a long time. There's newcomers. We need to vote in the marketplace with our food dollars. Because in this system we're in, the bottom line is this company, you know, like Kashi, I got a $400 check in the mail, class action. Now, I don't really give a hoot. I want to eat clean food. I want transparency in labeling. And if these companies, a lot of companies...
Let me cut you off, because I only have a minute
yeah,
left.
they
And
do
I want
class action lawsuits
yeah,
just as a way of doing business.
I got it.
But if they really...
But
have
really,
some-
I got you, because we're on the same
Right.
page in terms of activism and leverage. When I started out in 1996, thinking, what can we do? Well, there's Monsanto and DuPont and Dow, and they have huge amounts of money and tremendous, legendary influence in Washington and now in some state houses as well. And yet we just saw in 1999 the entire rejection of GMOs was not political. The entire rejection of GMOs was the tipping point. It was, remember that scientist who tested the potatoes, got fired and all? When he went public, over 700 articles on GMOs appeared in the UK press in a month. Within 10 weeks, Unilever publicly committed no more GMOs in Europe. The next day, Nestle's. The next week, virtually everyone else. It was the dollar. It was the tipping point that did it. So my angle for strategy in many countries where the biotech industry has tremendous influence in politics is to do consumer education and drive changes in the marketplace. And you're right, McDonald's did have a tremendous impact on stopping and actually eliminating, in 2001, Monsanto's genetically modified potato. They refused it, Burger King refused it, Pringles refused it, it was taken off the market. Now J.R. Simplot wants to introduce a GM potato, and McDonald's says we don't use it, and we have no plans to use it, so that might stop the introduction. I don't know. But I agree. In other countries, it's very much about politics. So I have a lot of testimonies before high-level committees all over the world, and I meet with ministers and heads of state all over the world, but not in Washington. I'm not invited in Washington because it's, in some cases it's locked down by the special interests. And I get in some meetings, but not like overseas, not like everywhere else. And I agree that politics is a little bit different game to play. So I share with you. So we're wrapping up here. Do we have a deadline we have to vacate, or can I take a few more questions?
I don't know that there's a deadline. Does anyone here know that? No, I don't have a deadline.
All right, I'll take a few more questions. Yes.
Have GMOs and Roundup influenced the depopulation of bees?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is probably. GMOs, well, let me back up and say that the colony collapse disorder is threatening bee populations. Most everyone here knows about it. The primary aspect is neonicotinoid insecticides, which have been very much linked with CCD, colony collapse. GMO corn and seeds have higher levels, up to 5 times the amount of these neonicotinoid insecticides. That's one way that it contributes. Second, Roundup exposure at tiny levels that are normal agricultural levels has shown in research to kill off bees in a hive. Roundup could explain some of the symptoms of colony collapse disorder that neonicotinoids cannot, like the destruction of beneficial bacteria, which is necessary for their digestion. So they can't digest the food. They're sitting next to bee bread, they're sitting next to all their food, and they die of malnutrition. Neonicotinoids may not be able to explain it. Roundup can. So I will release a video about this soon, suggesting that this is a potent area of research and is probably a major contributor. All right, we are wounded up. Yes, one last question, or 2 questions.
I just have one quick thing. The schools in the Sacramento area, I know for a fact, are using Roundup regularly, all around the school grounds. Breathing the Roundup will that have the same type of health effects over long term? I mean, I know eating it would be worse, but breathing it and stuff for the children?
Breathing is very serious. I don't know the relationships in terms of exposure. But a scientist friend of mine was spraying Roundup on some weeds, and he was also protecting his organic garden over here with coyote urine. Ran out of the coyote urine, realized the deer didn't like humans, so he tried using his own urine. Put it in a sprayer, killed the weeds.
Oh no.
He was spraying Roundup over here, and his urine had Roundup in it. He took some of the plants into his greenhouse, did the test, confirmed it, stopped spraying Roundup, his urine no longer killed the weeds. So he thought it might be absorbed through his shoes. It's got a surfactant which pushes it through barriers. So it could be rolling on the ground, or petting the dog that rolled on the ground. I don't know.
Or when you take your shoes off.
When you take your shoes off.
Do you ever envision a total ban on GMOs?
Do I envision a total ban on GMOs? I think I envision a total ban on GMO food and outdoor release of GMOs. I do not envision a ban on human gene therapy, on GMO research, on all that. And I don't think it's necessary. But I do envision a ban because right now the science supports it, and there is a market change here to support it. Russia is considering new legislation introduced by Putin to ban fully GMO growing in the country. They've already have a partial ban, and to restrict GMO imports. There's a lot of countries that are on board for GMO-free zones, from Peru to Switzerland and all over the world.
It looks like they're trying to release some genetically engineered mosquitoes now to fight a couple serious diseases like dengue fever. There are some that argue that if you suppress GMO food, the research and all that, you will also lose out on the advantage of doing something like that, saving humanity from a bad disease. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you. There's a company called Oxitec that has a technology that allows male mosquitoes to give birth to sterile offspring. And they used Aedes aegypti mosquitoes which carry dengue fever. And their plan is to release in Key Haven next to Key West in the spring millions of genetically engineered mosquitoes. Males. Now they claim that it's 100% sterility. They originally claimed that it was 100% sterility and that it was 100% males. It turns out there's a 3% survival rate, and in the presence of tetracycline, 15%. So they're disinforming the information, disinforming what's pretty critical, and there is a certain percentage of the saliva may be completely different in those mosquitoes. And I said, don't you think it's a good idea? And I said, what about testing that? He said, good idea. He said, good idea. He admitted it was a good idea. He had never known that research. He never did that research. And then I explained, well, what about the tetracycline? They found that when the mosquitoes were eating the dog food, they were surviving at 15 to 18%. Oh, there's tetracycline in the chicken and the dog food. Well, what about say under a sink, you have a drip, so you have a mosquito area, and now it's next to the dog food, and they're eating it, and I gave him the scenario, and he said, oh, it's very unlikely. And I'm thinking, unlikely? You're releasing millions and millions and millions of mosquitoes. And I'm saying you are potentially altering the gene pool forever, and he says it's unlikely. I don't want to hand the keys to the gene pool to a company that has that type of thinking. And we interviewed a scientist who's pro-GM bug, and she said they need to test for the stability of the gene. She tested the stability of her gene for 200 times in the lab, and it survived, and they put it into a contained field trial. It lasted 10 generations, and it disappeared. So let's say it disappears. Now you have genetically engineered mosquitoes that are not necessarily creating sterile offspring, that might be creating something else. So this is just like it's the same concept of an invasive species, best described by the rabbits, the 24 rabbits put out on Christmas Eve in the 1800s in Australia, where there's no natural predator, and rabbits reproduce like rabbits. And they had hundreds of millions of rabbits, and they had no way to stop it. So if you look at what happened in the Brazilian city where they released these mosquitoes, dengue fever increased dramatically. Oxitec claims it had nothing to do with them. But there's another type of mosquito that also carries chikungunya, which can fill in that ecological niche if the Aedes aegypti is kicked out, and might carry dengue. So you have a whole unexplored ecosystem, and there might be something that will facilitate dengue fever in that because it hasn't been thoroughly tested, which might explain the increase in dengue fever, and they say it's not us without any justification. They were kicked out of the European Regulatory Authority when they wanted to introduce olive, what is it, gnats or something, because it turns out we would be eating them, the dead things in the olives. It was their science was so bad and so consistently bad, and it was not necessary because there were other ways of controlling the population that had been approved and actually developed in Florida that had never been implemented that could actually do a better job, but they were ignoring it because of the sexy new GM technology. So I testified about all these things, and you're right, malaria is killer, and wouldn't it be nice to introduce a genetically engineered solution to that? And I'd say eventually maybe, but now we don't know enough about DNA and interactions. They used to think that 98% of the DNA was junk DNA. Now they realize it's all interactive. And that they used to think it one gene, one protein. Now they realize it's networks. They don't understand the language of DNA, and yet they're making manipulations that will be forever. And you could have these very serious, dangerous mosquitoes released as a result. Unintended consequences. Good question. And that's irrelevant. I'll be speaking tonight on a radio show called Coast to Coast AM Radio with George Norrie from 10 to midnight. There'll be more than 10 million listeners. You're welcome to participate, and I will talk about the mosquitoes because an article came out this week that the FDA is debating its release in the spring. Yes?
Yeah, Jeffrey, we tested, moms across America tested mother's milk because the assertion is that this doesn't come through into our system, that just the Roundup passes through into urine. And we found 3 out of 10 mothers, most of whom were organic, had Roundup in their breast milk, glyphosate. And I tested mine. I was part of. We each paid $120 because the EPA doesn't test. They consider it safe. They're not testing for this residue in our bodies and everywhere else. We have to pay, so we pay $120. And we tested our water in Carmichael is 0.151 parts for glyphosate. So we're virtually watering our organic gardens with weed killer. We found it in Elk Grove. We didn't find it in Fair Oaks, which makes me wonder if as it runs downstream, the water and people putting on their gardens is accumulating for the downstream people that draw out of the river. Anyway, it really got me 100% organic when I tested my own urine, and I thought, I could cheat now and then. Can't.
Thank you. The breast milk discovery, they found levels that were, I think, 1,400 times the allowable level of glyphosate in drinking water in Europe, in breast milk in the United States. They also found that because there were such high levels, it completely debunked Monsanto's claim that it doesn't bioaccumulate. And that is really serious. If something just goes out of the body at the same rate that it comes in, then you have a consistent level of risk. If it accumulates in the tissues, that is really serious. So that was a serious finding, and again, it was citizen scientists, citizen activists that found it. Thank you for participating in that. Yes.
My question is, when you speak about how the DNA, our DNA is affected with such small amounts of glyphosate, I can't say the word. Anyway, and that's just one side of the story. What would you say is the ramifications of introducing other species into our food supply? Because now we're in gene, times. where they're actually putting genes of other species, you know, salmon into strawberries.
All right, so
things like that.
when-
What should we think? And one other part of that is that when we eat organic or non-GMO verified, is it actually telling us that we're not eating gene species from
All right,
other
so
animals?
I don't use the word genes
Or, I don't
to
know.
describe a species, but you can have genes from species. So the question is relevant because we're putting genes from bacteria, soybeans and corn, for example, and genes produce RNA, and they produce proteins. Now, RNA was thought for a long time to just be a handoff. You know, give me the information, I'll create a protein. Now it turns out RNA can cause allergies, RNA can regulate DNA, RNA can be inheritable. RNA.
What is this?
Ribonucleic acid, yes. There's deoxyribo and then there's ribo. They're gangs. So the RNA turns out to have a lot of serious implications, and that's never been evaluated by any regulator in the world in terms of GMOs. And now the biotech industry is intentionally bringing in certain types of RNA that can have a huge impact. There was a study done on bees where they exposed them to some RNA, double-stranded RNA, that were supposed to be the control, having no impact. It altered 1,100 genes expression. 1,100 genes, because it was a massive regulator. So that's one area where if you bring in new gene combinations, you can change the RNA profile. The proteins, that could cause allergic reactions. So the World Health Organization has criteria designed to minimize the likelihood that a foreign novel protein in the food supply will cause an allergic reaction. They can't guarantee that it won't, because in order to evaluate it, people don't get an allergic reaction from a single exposure. In order to properly evaluate it, you have to take thousands and thousands of people, expose it over time, and see who reacts. That's not ethical and it's not practical. So they look at the properties of the protein produced by a genetically engineered transgene and say, does it look similar to the properties of a protein of an allergen that we know about? And they say, if it has X, it's too similar. And we would recommend further study before either elimination, don't release it, or study it further. It turns out the soybeans and the corn and the papaya all fail the WHO criteria. They all have something in it that's too similar to known allergens. The amino acid sequence, in the case of all three, in the case of BT it's even more. But it's just a suggestion by the WHO. It's not a guarantee, and everyone claims all over the world as I speak, oh, we go with the WHO criteria. I said, really? Do you have GM soy in your diet? Sure. That violates the WHO criteria. So you have the proteins, and then you have the combinations of proteins, etc., which can create all these natural phytochemicals, some of which fight cancer, some of which cause cancer, none of which are properly evaluated in the GMOs. So it's the unpredicted side effects.
So the non-GMO verified, does it tell us when that label is on there whether or not there are genes?
What it tells you is if the genetic engineering content of the inputs is below a certain level on a consistent basis. So if the action threshold is 0.9% and you're buying corn chips, then most of the corn will be 0.9% or less, probably a lot less. Some may be higher. The corn can have genes from different species. So it's not a 100% guarantee, but it's the best we have right now, unless you buy something with no at-risk ingredients. No soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, zucchini, or yellow squash. No animal products from animals that have eaten that. Even then, you may have some contamination in storage and transport.
That 0.9% is the European standard. Is it also the standard across the other countries as well?
Not generally.
Not necessarily.
So are there any GMO foods imported here from other countries? Like
Are there GMO foods imported into the United States from other countries? They're not labeled? Well, there's like a handful of GMO products still sold in Europe. probably because they're imported from the United States to Europe, but you rarely see them here from Europe. China may be doing experimental research in GMOs, like they created rice, even though it wasn't officially commercialized. It was found in rice products in Europe and in Hong Kong. They may have created garlic and onions and tomatoes. We don't know because they're not talking about it, and we certainly import some of those. The regulatory system is so weak that there's no requirements for testing at all whatsoever if you import a GMO from another country. So you can genetically engineer something to cause harm, and it will have no regulatory trigger in the United States.
So, I mean, theoretically, GMO is a novel organism, mostly there's patent behind it by the biotech company in order to sell it. So, equivalent, I mean, practically, it's equivalent to drug, because...
Equivalent to what?
Drug, because, you know, it's patented, it's something so new that it has to be, you know, this official scientific enclosure, that there's a patent, there are some experiments, and it does have such incredible influence on our health. And it's not tested like drugs have to be, at least through 3-4 stages until, you know, it's released to the pharma industry. So what is the discrepancy that it's, I mean, drug is, I would say, even less legal than GMO in this case, because, you know, that's
Right.
our food.
So the question is, how is it that drugs have all these requirements, hundreds of millions of dollars in meeting those requirements, and even after they're released, during a period of 1.5 years, the FDA had to recall or relabel more than half of them, because even after all that huge review, they still got it wrong. And yet food that has all these potential consequences flies under the radar. There's a book coming out called Altered Genes, Twisted Truth by Stephen Drucker. I think it's being released yesterday. At least that was the latest date. I don't know when it actually is being released. And that will tell the story of what he considers to be the illegal approval in the FDA. He filed a lawsuit, and it's a very good book. It should be prosecuted, but it's hard. All right, I'm getting the sense that we're done. I have to go find some food, some non-GMO food, before my meetings with senators.
Good luck, right?
So I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to invite you to participate in your local food. Now, if you want to participate in GMO activism and education, and you're not already, who should you meet with to give your name and email? All right, so we have a man who's going to tell you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was very enlightening. As you heard Jeffrey say, we need to work together to raise this awareness. And Jessica, where are you in the house here?
Hi.
Jessica has a sign-up sheet right here. Please give her your name and your email at least, so that we can continue to work together as a group. And a short plug for the Grange folks, and Label GMO, and Moms Across America, and the Sacramento Community Grange. The Grange is the oldest agricultural organization in the country. We've been around for 145 years. We're not going anywhere. So if you give your name and email to Jessica, I promise you, we will stay in touch and we will work together. April?